All right. Everybody hear me all right? Yeah? All right. Guess I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right. Well, thanks, everybody, for coming out this evening, listening to me talk about Angler lurking in the domain shadows. So the majority of this talk is going to be about Angler exploit kit and domain shadowing, which is a technique that I came up with, I guess, earlier this year. I'll spend more time talking about Angler in general and all that stuff, too. Before we get started, take a second and talk about who I am. My name is Nick Biasini. I am a threat researcher with the Talos Group. Spent basically my entire career in security. The overwhelming majority of that was in SOCs. Started off as an analyst working third shift in a 24/7 environment. I've been an engineer, a manager, did CNA and policy very briefly, and now I'm back as a researcher and couldn't be happier. May ask yourself why coffee beans? Anybody who's worked third shift in a SOC knows coffee is your best friend, and I am not afraid to admit that a lot of what I've accomplished on this slide, as well as in this talk, is largely due to coffee. Okay, so here's an overview of what I'll talk about. I like to spend a minute or two and just give a quick exploit kit overview. I'll talk specifically about Angler, and then spend the majority of the time talking about what domain shadowing is, how I found it, scope, stuff like that. And then I'll finish up with some other techniques that Angler's been using lately, some info about payloads, and then finally some detection stuff. So what are exploit kits? I'd like to use this example of an assembly line, because that's kind of how I look at it. So it's a software package that's available for users to buy or rent. The whole idea is you add your components. So things like, what domains do you want to use for redirection? What domains do you want to use for landing page and exploitation? What IP addresses? What exploits do you want to target? What payloads do you want to deliver? And then at the end, you basically have a web framework set up to compromise users. But how do users get compromised? There are two primary ways that users get into the actual infection chain. The first is malvertising. Malvertising is just a malicious advertisement that a adversary will pay to have hosted on some sort of ad network. Whole idea is user goes to some website, usually a larger one, get redirected via a banner ad or something into a redirection chain, then end up on a landing page, end up getting exploited, deliver some sort of payload, compromise. The other primary one, and what I've seen a lot out of Angler lately, is the use of compromised websites, largely WordPress sites. A lot of people ask themselves, why is it a big deal when there's some random plugin in WordPress that has a vulnerability against it? This is the reason why. Threat actors use that information, and they compromise a very wide range of websites. They don't deface it. They don't really change it much. All they do is they drop an iframe in the main page or some subpage. The whole idea being that a user would browse to the web page, say their local restaurant. While they're looking at the menu in the background, there's a redirection going on, landing page being served, and they're being compromised without ever realizing it. Now, I've seen this be invisible to users where they have no notification at all. I've seen them actually land on a full landing page, and I've also seen where the landing page gets popped in some little tiny iframe up in the corner. So there's a lot of different ways users are getting compromised, but at a high level, that's it. They end up in one of those two places, end up in the gate, landing page, exploit page, payload, and then they're compromised. So Angler. I like to call it the innovation-driven exploit kit. Reason being, it is innovating and evolving at an alarming rate. So far in 2015, it has had a banner year. Started off with the Adobe Flash 0 day. That's really rare for exploit kits to use that type of technology and drop a 0 day in their exploitation chain. But they weren't done. They've done a lot more throughout the year. And I'm going to talk about not only what I observed from the initial zero-day campaign, but what I've also seen as time has gone on. Now, one of the reasons that they're so effective is their use of exploits. Now, this is a pretty cool chart, a lot of information on here. Key thing to note are the red lines. That is when Angler was seen actively exploiting a vulnerability. Gray lines are when patches were made available. If you notice here, this is the one exception with the 0-day where the red line precedes the gray line. Most of the time, though, as you note, it's shortly afterwards that Angler started exploitation. Now, this graph actually only goes up until June. As you know, there were a couple of really, really large 0-days that came out in July. Angler was exploiting those in some cases within hours, and at the most within 1 to 2 days. Now, the one last key thing to note on here are these blue dots. So these represent the amount of times that we've seen in our telemetry the various versions of Adobe Flash. The one key thing to note here is as recently as June, there's still a very significant amount of users using 16.0.0.235. That means that they're vulnerable to basically every exploit on here, plus the ones that have came out since then. So that's the reason why you still see Angler actively exploiting CVE 2015-0313, 0359, 0336. It's because it's still extremely effective at compromising systems. Users really don't patch, shockingly. So as I said before, this all kind of started with the 0-day campaigns. Our group, and me specifically, were tasked at looking at these campaigns and what they were doing. So these are all exploit pages associated with Angler that were linked to that campaign, or one of the campaigns. When I was looking at this, I noticed something a little odd. The use of the domains that are being used here. It's not uncommon to see things like random character generation, weird TLDs involved. This, however, looked a little different. It's a weird variety of domains. So I decided to kind of dig into it. I spent a few days, couple of weeks, basically focusing around the domains and the activity that we were seeing to try and figure out what was going on, if it was something interesting. So how did I start? Take, for instance, the first domain that was listed on that slide a couple slides ago, this unsuspective.kevinspain.net. So I was like, okay, this is an interesting domain. Let me look and see what other subdomains are hosting Angler activity. I was able to pivot, and this is just a small subset, but as you can see here, there's a fair amount of subdomains being utilized by Angler. Now, my initial thought, as with most people, would be, okay, it's a bad domain. Seems really logical, right? And that isn't actually what I found, though. What I found is that the core domain, kevinspain.net, was actually being hosted on a completely legitimate IP, non-malicious. The website itself was fine, nothing wrong with it at all. However, if you look specifically for that unsuspective.kevinspain.net, I actually found it pointing to this IP, which was, what, 176.31.125.191. That was definitely a bad IP. It was malicious, I knew it. So I wanted to know what else could I find on that IP. So I pivoted, and I found this. This is just a small subset. For some reason, it's all co.uk addresses. I assure you there were other TLDs involved. This is just the subset that I pulled. But what you can see here is there are a fair amount of different regular domains hosting malicious subdomains on the same IP address. Not that peculiar, but still a little odd. So I went back to kevinspain.net and searched a little further. So I went to domain tools, looked up kevinspain.net, found an email address associated with it. I also noted that it's associated with 14 other domains. So I went and found those 14 other domains, which are listed here. A pretty wide variety of random domains. Again, this is just a random example that I picked out, but you can see here there's just random smattering. The key thing to note are these Nevada Networks ones. So what I did is I took this data and said, okay, well, maybe, is there any other malicious activity associated with these domains? And that's exactly what I found. What I found is using completely different IP infrastructure associated with different campaigns, I saw different subdomains associated with that same user's domains that he had registered. So this is what I started digging into. I started here, and I started rinsing and repeating. I started pivoting on core domains, Angler activity that I knew was active, what subdomains were being utilized, what IP addresses, what registrant accounts, and just rinsing and repeating and trying to figure out what this is, what am I stumbled upon here. And what I called it is domain shadowing. Basically what I found is adversaries specifically associated with Angler were hijacking legit domains, just random domains, and then hosting malicious subdomains underneath them, and then linking those to IP addresses that were hosting Angler. And what I realized is this is kind of a next evolution. So if you go back years, it wasn't uncommon to see things like hard-coded IP addresses in scripts associated with malicious activity. Go to 1.2.3.4 and download this file. It's really effective. You don't have to rely on DNS. Works really well. It's also really great for defenders because we can just go log into a firewall, add this IP to a block list on an ACL, done. Threat's over with. Adversaries realized that, and they changed. They changed to registering their own domains. So now they go out, register their own domain, host malicious activity under that. Makes it a little more difficult to block. They're able to rotate IPs, things like that. You can blacklist domains. They can register new ones. But what we found is that adversaries are really bad at OPSEC associated with domain registration. So what you see is things like reused email addresses, reused names, mailing addresses, phone numbers. Makes it really easy for us to track. So what we can do is we can say, okay, we have a kind of a summary of what this threat actor does, what their key indicators are when it comes specifically to domain registration. As soon as they register a domain, it's blacklisted before it's ever used. Adversaries, again, they catch on. So they move to dynamic DNS. Dynamic DNS, great idea. For home users, you always want to get to your computer. I need a way to make sure that even though I have an ISP that uses dynamic IPs, I can still get there. That's where dynamic DNS comes in. Basically allows you to point whatever IP you have or whatever IP you want to a subdomain associated with a dynamic DNS provider. Great way to be able to always access your computer. But it's a better way for threat actors to hide and be able to do domain usage without any tracking whatsoever. And, keep in mind that all of this is still being used today. I'm still seeing hard-coded IPs, registered domains, and dynamic DNS. Specifically with dynamic DNS, though, what we found is enterprises and companies really started to evaluate why would you allow dynamic DNS. There's no real legitimate business use for it. So what we've seen is a lot of people just blacklisting dynamic DNS across the board. Every once in a while, a new one will pop up, but it's pretty easy to get caught up and add it to your blacklisting technology. Just makes it that much easier to stop. So again, threat actors had to evolve, and that's when they started moving to domain shadowing. So how big of a deal is this? How widespread, how much people or accounts are affected? In the time I was researching, which ended up being like a month, maybe a little more, I was able to find 25,000 unique subdomains being used specifically for Angler activity. Now those 25,000 subdomains were associated with thousands of core domains. Those thousands of core domains were associated with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of registrant accounts. And that's just what I could see. Keep in mind that some of these people did have privacy protection turned on, so I couldn't really get an absolute view of how many actual accounts were affected. as well as how many domains. That's just my lowball figure, is somewhere around 2,000. But how are they doing this, and what are they targeting? The basic idea is phishing. So you phish registrant accounts. There is not, a month that goes by that you don't hear about some sort of phishing campaign targeting usually GoDaddy. What I found was that all of the domains that I found that were being shadowed were actually owned by GoDaddy. Now, that has nothing to do with GoDaddy itself. They do a lot of great services for their customers. They offer two-factor authentication. But if you think about it from a threat actor perspective, if you're going to spend the time and the money and the energy to build a phishing campaign and get users to click on the links and build the infrastructure to host the pages to gather the information, you're going to want to go where you get the most bang for your buck. And that, without a doubt, is GoDaddy. Last time I checked, they controlled about 1/3 of the domains on the internet. So obviously, if you're going to go after one, that is the one to go after. They're like 5 or 6 times the size of the nearest competitor. So why registrant accounts? Short answer is no one logs into them. I mean, how many people here own domains? Anybody? Okay. How many of you have logged into your registrant account more than twice in the last 6 months? A few. But keep in mind, we're security people. We tend to do it more than most people would. Most people log in to do 2 things: to update IP addresses associated with the domains that they own, and to renew the subscription for the domains. That's it. Adversaries realize that, and they take advantage of it. By compromising these accounts and adding these malicious subdomains, not only do users never log in and check, they don't really receive notifications for this type of thing by default. And on top of that, most times it's not really intuitive where subdomains are in a lot of these portals that they have. And look, domain shadowing is a really cool technique, and it's a very effective way to bypass a couple of key technologies. The first is looking at sites that are related to blacklisting. So if your primary technology that you're supporting is doing blacklisting, this basically defeats it. So you have to keep in mind that yes, there are 25,000 subdomains, but most of them were active for less than 30 minutes. Some of them were active for only 5. If you're trying to keep on top of this by doing blacklisting, by the time you actually get the site blacklisted, they've already moved on to 2 or 3 domains down the line. Not only are they blocking and changing to different subdomains, but they're changing the core domains associated with it. One other interesting thing that I found is under accounts where there was more than 1 domain associated with it, without exception, they used more than 1. I could not find a single example where they used every single one. I don't know why. Could be that they're saving it for later, but it's just an interesting tidbit. And look, if all Angler did was that, it would be a pretty cool way to help bypass blacklisting technologies. And again, by using these known websites that other people own, you're going to get away from a lot of web reputation type stuff. So most of these sites had, when Angler activity started, had either no web reputation or a slightly positive one. Usually it changes as time goes on because you got a lot of Angler activity going on. It gets downgraded pretty quick, but it does at least create those windows. And that's kind of a theme with Angler, is they're all about creating windows to compromise users. Now, this isn't all they did. There are a bunch of other techniques that they used. And I'm going to talk about a few of them. You can see them here. So let's start with landing page shenanigans. Now, historically, if you look at a landing page for an exploit kit, if a user ends up there, they're going to end up with a giant screen of gibberish, a bunch of junk that is likely to make them freak out, close a web browser, do what users do when they get compromised. I don't know, run around with their hands over their heads, whatever. But they're going to have some sort of an adverse reaction. They're going to say, okay, wait a minute, this isn't right, and quickly close their browser and try and figure out what happened. So Angler did something different. they use quotes in the text. This is actually what a landing page would look like. All the quotes are from Sense and Sensibility for some reason. But there are a couple of reasons why they would do this. The first, as I said, is for users. If a user ends up at this page, they're probably going to be a little less likely to freak out as quickly. They might pause for a second and say, what is this? Or just say, oh, I must have clicked some wrong link, and go back and not necessarily close the web browser. Again, little things to help prevent users from reacting adversely and getting compromised. The other reason is for machine learning. So if you're using machine learning to try and detect malicious activity, it's a lot more difficult to detect this from normal web pages than it is a random page of gibberish, what you would normally see. But again, Angler's not done. Let's talk about 302 cushioning. So 302 cushioning, this is actually associated with the redirection chain. 302 cushioning is just using HTTP 302s, which are moved temporarily. They are super common on the internet. Every major web page uses them. You just don't realize that they're there. Great example. You go to google.com, you're actually getting a 302 redirecting you to www.google.com. Threat actors are using this because they know that it's all over the internet. It's a lot harder to detect redirection when you're using a technology that everyone else is using. It's another cool way to try and get users infected. Now, I talked about domain shadowing. What I didn't mention is domain shadowing was actually also being used in the redirection chain. So they were using completely different registrant accounts with completely different domain shadows just to redirect users as well. Now, this is something that is more recent. This started, I want to say, mid-June, probably, and has continued up until 2 or 3 weeks ago. This URL structure change that they've done. And as I said before, there are two main parts to exploit kits: landing pages and exploit pages, basically. So you go back to the beginning of the year. This is the URL structure you would see for an Angler landing page. If you're looking at it from a regex perspective or a detection perspective, pretty straightforward. Just a big string of numbers. That's pretty easy to write detection for. As time went on, they changed. Not a lot, just a little bit. But again, increasing the amount of characters in the folder structure, adding some dashes. I've seen underscores as well. But again, the whole idea here is subtle changes to compromise users. If your detection technology is relying on this type of stuff, these small changes will create windows for them to compromise. But what we really saw in June was a drastic change to this. Now this is totally different, as you can tell. They're using search as the keyword in the URL now. And they're passing a ton of parameters with it. Now this actually looks exactly like a Bing search. Now, to be fair, if you see the queries, they're gibberish. You know, most users aren't going to search for something like that. However, if you're looking at this programmatically and you're trying to write, say, a regex to try and detect something like this from normal English text, it becomes much, much more difficult. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. Again, this major change caused a lot of detection headaches. You know, there was a lot of animosity about how they changed, but they weren't done. A couple of weeks later, they changed again. Now we're using this, which is just EnglishWord.php. Now, one thing to note here is the use of these single character parameters. There's a bunch of them in here. They were initially doing a set amount of parameters that made it a little easier to detect. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long. What they did is they rotated to something like this. And this is where they sit as of Friday of last week, the last time I really looked at Angler. So what they did is they pivoted to this. Now there are two other variants of this. There's view topic, view forum, and search.php. Now you might think to yourself, well, that's not really a step in the right direction, because before they were using just random English words. Now, the thing is, viewtopic.php, viewforum.php, and search.php are extremely common. You go to any website that does any sort of forum functionality or does basic searching, odds are you're going to end up on a viewtopic.php, viewforum.php, or search.php page. This is virtually impossible to pull out of telemetry if all you're doing is looking for URL structure. And that's exactly why they do it. Compromise users. Now look, changing the landing page URL structure is awesome, but it doesn't help you if you don't change the exploit structure as well. Because all you do is you get a bunch of people hitting landing pages, and then your detection technology catches the exploit page, so users don't get compromised. So they did something similar with exploit side. Again, going back to the beginning of the year. Big long string of text. One special character. I think I saw a couple that were like 2, mostly dashes and underscores. It's pretty easy. I mean, that's not really the most standard thing you're going to see in a URI on the internet. As time went on, they changed a little bit. Again, increasing the length of the string, adding a couple more special characters. Nothing really earth-shattering. But then, to coincide with that change to search that I talked about before, they changed to something like this. Now, this looks extremely similar, but if you look at the first two, you may note there's no extension. And this one uses .pycharm. So before, it wasn't that difficult to write a regex or logic to look for, say, flash files that had no extension on them, that had maybe 25 or more characters in them. This would get you a fair amount of Angler activity. Apparently they realized that and decided to change. So they started using extensions. The one here is .pycharm, and then adding parameters to it. In these cases, they're numerical based. They tended to be this way for a while. We did see some legitimate extensions, things like .aspx, .php. Those are legit extensions. We also see a bunch of junk, like .java2 and .cppbin. Initially, there was somewhere between 15 and 20 different extensions they were using. But as I said before, they were passing word-based numeric parameters, and it was actually 2 all of the time. That lasted for maybe 2 weeks, and then this happened. Now again, this is where we sit today, as of Friday. English word-based .random extension. Now when I say random, I mean random. I don't really see much duplication in these. Some of them are word-based, some of them are random strings of text. It's just random. And on top of that, they started changing the parameters. Now they have model, sound, street, whatever. Now they're varying not only the number of parameters, but the labels that they're using and the types of labels. All designed to evade detection. So why are they doing all this? You know, yes, they evade detection, but what's the reason? What are they delivering as a payload? And there's an emphasis on pay there. If you note, all of the payloads associated with Angler are associated with monetization. There's a direct way for them to monetize the type of stuff that they're dropping on systems. The first one is BDEP downloader. So BDEP downloader is the malware downloader that is exclusive to Angler. It is virtually always dropping click fraud. I threw something in here. So click fraud is basically a way for them to monetize the system being compromised by using scripts to generate clicks on ads. Now, I threw a little detection bonus in here. Up until 2 weeks ago, if you were to see a domain lookup for www.earthtools.org, followed up with a domain lookup for www.ecb.europa.eu, that box, 99 times out of 100, had BDEP on it. It actually uses these 2 domains in its DGA. Now, interestingly enough, the user that owned www.earthtools.org a week and a half ago pulled that domain off of the internet. And for 4 days, BDEP was completely broken. It did not work at all because it relied on that domain. So what you would see is a ton of lookups for earthtools.org that went nowhere, followed by repeated alternating between it and Google. Now, after 4 days, the owner shifted and put up new.earthtools.org. Within a matter of hours, the DEP was updated, the DGA was updated, and now it was working again. So now, if you see these 2 domains being resolved in your telemetry, go look at that box, because I virtually guarantee you it is compromised with BDEP. But that's not the only payload. The overwhelming majority of the rest of the payloads were ransomware. Now, ransomware is basically just encrypting files, holding them ransom for money. The majority of the infections that we saw were CryptoWall 3.0. That's just kind of the favorite, I guess, among people that pay for Angler. We've seen other ones. We've seen AlphaCrypt, TeslaCrypt, recently saw CTB Locker. But there's an awful lot of ransomware being pushed by Angler. Now, every once in a while, I would see a Trojan get dropped. And there is some news and research recently that indicates that these Trojans are associated with finding point-of-sale terminals. So you find point-of-sale terminals for one reason, to compromise credit cards. Again, it's all about money with Angler. They are very, very good at getting users compromised and delivering payloads that get money to their consumers. And that's exactly why they're so successful right now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about detection. Regex is your friend. You can do a lot with regex searches to find Angler activity, but you have to stay diligent with this stuff. You have to keep up on open source resources, follow people on Twitter, look at how it's changing over time, because I'm going to tell you right now, your regex that works today likely won't work in a couple of days, and it definitely won't work in a month, because Angler is really, really good at changing. But there are other things you can look out for in your data. I talked about domain shadowing. Looking for multiple subdomains under a single domain. But not just looking for that, looking for longer length strings. Angler doesn't always use long length strings in their subdomains, but most websites don't use long length subdomains at all. You see a lot of www. Mail. Forum. Stuff like that. You don't see a lot of 10, 12 character subdomains. Looking for a bunch of subdomains resolving to a single domain, as well as resolving to different IPs, is another key indicator. I said before, 302s are super common. What you don't see is 302s stacked. Angler does that periodically. So that's another thing to look for. Where you see users hitting 302 to another 302 to another 302, that's something that should be a red flag. And this last one here is a little noisy, I'm not going to lie. But if you start using these other ones to reduce the data set, you'll end up with something useful. If you look for Adobe Flash that doesn't have a .swf extension on it, it's another way to start hunting for this type of stuff. One key thing to mention is when Angler did the random extensions a while ago, they started using .play. And I thought that would be a fantastic thing to pivot off of. Look for Flash files with .play extensions. Coincidentally, Dailymotion uses .play for their Flash videos, so it didn't work out too well for me. But keep in mind, look, your IDS IPS coverage usually does a really good job at catching landing and exploit pages. You know, they know that this stuff is very active. They're going to do a good job at catching it. But this thing is changing so much, and you have to keep in mind that these changes create windows. How long of a window are we talking about? It really depends on the change and the technology that you're using to detect it. Some cases, it's only a matter of hours or a day. But sometimes it could be as much as a week before your vendor releases an updated signature that catches this stuff reliably. That's when all this other stuff comes in handy. You got to use that type of research to try and find it. Because yes, IDS, IPS are good at catching it, but when changes are made, systems are going to get compromised, and you need to have ways to try and find it that don't rely on that type of technology. So domain shadowing was so effective that it started being copied. You know, what is it they say? That imitation is the highest form of flattery. If that's the case, then anglers should be very flattered, because exploit kits are using domain shadowing more and more. We saw Rig pick it up within a matter of months. We've seen Neutrino pick it up, and recently we saw Nuclear added as well. This stuff is very, very effective, so more and more exploit kits are going to continue to use it, because it works. I just like throwing this in here. Because you're dealing with a bunch of random domains from time to time, every once in a while you just can't help but laugh at some of the random combinations that come up. So yeah, this is all stuff that I find in telemetry while I'm looking. Okay. Still got a few minutes left. So I'm going to illustrate to you part of the reason why this is so nasty and such a beast to try and detect. Let's play a game. Let's play Spot the Exploit Kit. There are 3 URLs there. Anybody care to take a guess which one of those 3 is actually Angler? Anybody?
Last one.
I think you're actually right. You are. So here, if you look at this kind of gives away a little bit. This is what I was talking about when I say looking for long stringed subdomains. That is the actual Angler activity. But look, this is not easy to detect. If all you're looking at is this URI structure, it's really, really hard to say that is definitely an exploit kit. Very, very difficult. This is what Angler does. Let's do one more. This as well. This is a little old because it's the search syntax that isn't really being used that much anymore. Same idea though. Very, very difficult if all you're looking at URI structure. Now, to be fair, this one actually put 2 on there. If I do this, it becomes very, very easy to tell which ones. But, you know, they aren't always this obvious. This is just the type of thing that Angler does all the time. Okay, so I figured I'd throw this in here. This is my hunting pro tip associated with actually hunting for Angler. I make no guarantees how long this will be valid for, but if you are looking in raw telemetry trying to find this kind of stuff, this is a great place to start. As I mentioned before, starting with view topic, view forum, and search.php. Looking for none or just a little bad web reputation, and then a bunch of this stuff is associated with just filtering out noise. I've not recently seen Angler hosted on a subdomain of www. Just because they're using domain shadowing. When you have this, you're likely to run into a user actually using it as opposed to just using random strings of text. And a lot of this other stuff, the forum things are trying to get past the view topic and view forum just because you end up seeing it a lot in telemetry. But it's a good starting point. So look, exploit kits kind of get dismissed a lot. They are really bad. This whole idea that sophistication is exclusive to advanced threats, that's really antiquated and old. It's just not true anymore. Look, Angler is compromising users, delivering payloads that give money to the people that pay for it. Because of that, there's a lot of money to be made. They're throwing a lot of money at development. They're changing and evolving all the time. They're coming out with all these new techniques and ideas, and all the rest of the exploit kits realize how successful they are, and they start copying. All of these exploit kits are really upping their game. You know, Angler is infecting users at a really, really high rate. And as other groups start taking on this type of technology, you're going to start seeing the exploit kits, the other ones like Neutrino, Rig, and Nuclear evolving in the same ways and compromising the same amount of users. Also on here is just a bunch of exploit kit blogs. I've tended to write a lot about exploit kits this year just because they're doing a bunch of really cool stuff. And that's my Twitter handle. I encourage you to follow me just because I try to tweet about this stuff. I'm hunting Angler a lot lately. If I find an active campaign, I try to tweet out the IP address, what it's dropping, you know, try and use that stuff to help protect your users and yourselves. I think that's basically all I have. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
So with the domains that you were just finding, So with the domains that you were finding, did you check any of those against OpenDNS? Were they actually being picked up by them? Because I know they spent a lot of time with machine learning. So I was curious if any of the domain hits you're finding, do they show up, what the delay is for them to be able to detect and catch that?
So I wasn't actually looking specifically at OpenDNS data. I was just looking at the domains after they were already being used for compromise. So I wasn't sure how fast they were getting picked up by their technology that they're using.
Okay, and a follow-up to that is, with the domains that you were tracking and all the other subdomains that were being registered, could you talk a little bit about the tools that we're using to pivot on those to basically follow the trail?
Sure. Was
it simply just looking at the using the Whois records, et cetera, and following back on the accounts, or
so I was leveraging passive DNS a lot. So passive DNS is basically like a historic lookup of domains. It allowed me to go back in time and say, okay, I have this core domain. How many subdomains are resolving to it? Okay. What IPs are resolving? How long were they active for? How many times were they seen? That was the type of data that I was using very heavily for that type of stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So?
Oh, actually, I'm going to abuse my privilege. I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have any hypothesis about what suddenly drove the evolution that you saw going from the relatively simplistic to the very sophisticated strings that suddenly changed? Do you think there was anything driving that?
So if I had to guess, it would be money. Just because there's, in the last year or so, ransomware has completely exploded, and there is a ton of money to be made. So what they're doing is they're upping their game, because now there's people dropping money into development because they know there's a huge return on investment.
That makes sense.
I was wondering about the age of the DNS registration entry and the value of that in determining whether exploiting is going on, or even as a correlator.
So age is in when the actual domain was registered versus when it was being exploited?
You mentioned it before on about slide 6 or 7, and then on your detection page you didn't mention it at all, but it's something that's talked about.
So the actual domains as they were being registered, I didn't really see a lot of correlation between a new domain being registered and then immediately exploited via Angler. A lot of times what you would see is they would just have random, 9, 12, sometimes 100 domains registered. And what would happen is once the account theoretically is compromised, they would start using it for Angler activity. Now, what I did find is that over time they would use some domains here and there, but it wasn't like a free-for-all where it was like, oh, I got an account, let me hurry and run and do Angler activity. It would kind of be like a slow trickle over time.
I spent a lot of time on Angler myself, and I found that it wouldn't drop twice to the same IP. I was curious if you experienced that and what the time was.
So drop, you mean like as far as using the same IP multiple times?
Well, if I hit like a blog I knew was compromised, it would drop the exploit to me and I could watch it happen. Mm-hmm. But then if I were to try to hit it again with a new sheep dip on the same IP, it wouldn't go. So I had to go and get a new IP, and then it would hit me again.
I hadn't really spent a lot of time researching. It's interesting, though. I haven't. I'll have to check that the next time I'm hunting. I'll run stuff multiple times and see what happens.
Were you making exactly the same request?
Sometimes a little bit different requests. Just depended. I would usually just clear out all the session keys and start over with a new incognito or in private session.
Some of them do like incognito keys. So if it depends on how early in the refer chain you were, so if you were hitting at the compromised blog that gives you the redirect, or were you hitting later in the chain?
In this case, it was a blog, specific blog page that was compromised. So I had, like 5 machines I just built. So I'd plug one in and hit it and try to take a PCAP of it or a video or whatever, and then try it again. And the second and so on times it just wouldn't deliver the payload.
It depends a little bit on the TDS. Some TDSs will filter out repeat IPs and some don't. It just depends on who they're pushing traffic through.
I'm curious what kind of false positives you were seeing with your rules list. So like the 302 chains, those remind me of like an OAuth flow or something like that. And what other things were you seeing?
So I do see 302. Sometimes I would stumble upon other exploit kits, which is a fun coincidence, but a lot of that stuff is just about decreasing the data set. It depends on what you're starting with to try and eliminate some of the noise. That's basically what the goal is there. Okay.
Other questions? What do you think the future holds? How can it get any scarier?
Who knows? I've never ceased to be amazed by anglers, so you never know what they're going to be up to next. Probably more exploits. Who knows? Yeah.
Better transmission of the payload.
Yeah, and I didn't even get a chance to talk about that. So there's so much more. I mean, there's the stuff that they're doing with the encoding of landing pages, the stuff that they're doing for encoding and encrypting the payloads. There's a lot more that Angler's doing that I just didn't have time to talk about.
Do you see this mostly coming from Eastern Europe or like China, any particular country?
No, there's not. I mean, not really. It tends to use some ASNs repeatedly, but there's not really a lot of specific origin that I could say this area is definitely where it's coming from.
What do you mean by coming from? Like where the compromised pages are, or where the payloads are?
What I think the compromised pages are being attacked to, where the exploits are coming from.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Let's thank our last speaker of the day.
Okay. Thanks a lot, guys.